morning. So the topic that I'm here to talk to you about is climate change from an economic, financial, legal risk element. As we have seen already, the changing climate is causing more frequent and ferocious weather events, decreasing recovery times between those events, and increasing the probability of simultaneous events occurring in multiple locations. This summer, we have seen the devastation caused by compounding weather events, coinciding droughts and heat waves worsening the effects of the bushfires. These combined with increased volatility increases the likelihood of the non-linear impact on the economy. And as we know, for regional and rural communities, these will continue to be disproportionately affected by the physical impacts of climate change. The cost of the 2009 bushfires was conservatively estimated by the Royal Commission as $4.1 billion, with general insurance payouts to businesses and properties around the $1.2 billion mark. The Victorian and Commonwealth governments, as well as the Victorian Bushfire Appeal Fund, supported the response costs, damage costs, housing support and emergency costs, as the small local councils were highly unequipped to deal with them at these times. That $4.1 billion figure doesn't even take into account secondary costs, such as mental, physical health impacts. These were looked at and assessed after the Queensland floods, and the secondary costs associated with those, health, social, from fertilities, impacts on mental health, physical, exacerbation of chronic illness, and physical injury, were estimated to actually exceed the cost of the primary impacts to infrastructure and commerce, looking at the around $7 billion figure mark. In Victoria, the councils that were affected in the 2009 bushfires operated on a deficit, and rate revenue was down around $1.5 million each year for the 4 years following the fires, due to re-evaluation of properties, loss of infrastructure, and economic bases. Government grants were made available, and the local councils would not have been able to survive without them. As we've already seen and heard, the cost of this summer's bushfires comparatively is absolutely unprecedented. So we all know and are all aware that the physical risks of climate change are extremely real and happening literally as we speak. However, climate change has now evolved from a purely ethical, greeny, environmental issue that presents physical risks to one that it now presents foreseeable financial risks and opportunities. It is a major threat to Australia's financial stability. It can have an effect on the productivity capacity of economy if funds are being diverted towards recovery and rebuilding on a more frequent and larger scale. This is especially true in rural and regional communities, where recovery and rebuilding costs are becoming greater and potentially required on a more frequent basis. In an attempt to mitigate the physical impacts of climate change, it has widely been accepted that the world's temperature must be kept well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial times. And in 2016, 196 countries signed the Paris Agreement, committing to do just that. All of the signatory countries have agreed that they need to implement their own policies that are consistent with keeping global warming to well below 2 degrees, and that the global economy should operate on a net zero basis by 2050. The transition path to a less carbon-intensive world is going to be quite different depending on whether it's a managed gradual process or it's it's 2045, we've not done anything, quick, turn the tap off. Ideally, it will be smooth and well planned, and that will need to be facilitated by not only governments but the private sector. And around the world, governments are starting to take action, including at a state level. Here in Australia, Victoria's climate change bill reflects the terms of the Paris Agreement. Stable and credible policies are really crucial for managing both the physical risks of climate change and steering economies through the transition to decarbonise the global economy. And looking at some of the examples across the world, New Zealand has introduced a bill for zero emissions by 2050, and they've actually split their emissions reductions targets into carbon and biogenic methane, aiming to reduce biogenic methane by 10% by 2030 and 43% by 2050. So the economic transition risks associated with climate change are those market impacts driven by policy, technology, and the social responses to the physical risks. A big area for transition at the moment is internal combustion engine cars. This picture identifies all of the countries in the world which currently have bans or penalties attached to driving cars with internal combustion engines. As the world responds to the physical risks of climate change and tries to mitigate the impacts, innovation and improvements in technology allow for more competition in markets. Battery storage and electrification of vehicles is a classic example of a market at work. In London now, there are ultra-light zones where there is a penalty incurred for driving those big gas-guzzling Range Rovers through the congestion zone, and those charges are on top of any congestion fees. Another example of this is the renewable energy sector. There has been a rapid decline in the cost of renewable energy sources, in part because of extensive spending on research and development. The greeny hippie folk at places like McKinsey and Bloomberg have said that for 75% of developed countries, it's more expensive on a marginal cost basis now to run a coal plant than it is to buy a brand new solar one and run it on battery. And the shifting preferences are also coming from investors, consumers, and employees. All of those three are a real risk to businesses if adaptation to climate change isn't taken into account. Investors and financiers are worried about companies' abilities to continue to make a profit and return in light of physical and transition risks of climate change. They want to know how the risks are impacting your business and what strategies you are doing and adaptations you are taking to go forwards to ensure financial stability. They expect clear, informed decisions to make their decision making. And stakeholder preferences, millennials do not know a world without resource scarcity, and it is an issue that they take extremely seriously. It's being taught in schools to children, and they will become the people working in your businesses, buying your products, and they care about these things. The World Economic Forum has now identified climate change mitigation and adaptation as the most impactful global economic risk. And failure to adapt to the risks of climate change can have huge financial impacts, not only globally, but on country economies and those smaller economies within, and especially in rural and local communities. Insurance companies are starting to face unanticipated payouts because of climate change related property damage and business losses. And in some cases, this could start to impact businesses and households' ability to access insurance. It's therefore really important to not only think differently about the climate change, the frequencies of events, but to reassess the assumptions about the severity and longevity of these events. The insurance industry has started to recognize this and are starting to price things differently, or in some cases, unfortunately, leaving people without access to insurance because the cost is just too high. In the absence of adaptation, it is inevitable that insurance premiums will rise. And not all hazards that are climate related are covered by commercial insurance. Coastal inundation, erosion, subsidence are all generally excluded, and therefore those people and businesses who are affected by them are essentially self-insured or insured by the taxpayer. The Climate Council estimates that 1 in every 19 property owners face the prospect of insurance premiums that will essentially be unaffordable by 2030. Looking around insurance costing 1% of the property value per year. The study that they took considered the top 10 most impacted local government areas and the impacted properties. And in Victoria, these properties where the annual average risk cost would be 1% more of value of the property, Greater Shepparton was ranked 7th in the list and Horsham 8th. Insurers like certainty and managed risk, and adaptation and resilience planning provides the opportunity to show insurers you know what the risks are and this is what you're doing to try and deal with them. Therefore, those risks can be more appropriately considered and more appropriately priced. An example of this is IAG, who set the premiums and risk ratings for all the Coles insurance home policies. And the premiums are assessed on an individual property level, taking into account history, location, and increasing exposure to disasters. And this has actually led them to cease to offering insurance in some high-risk locations. However, it does also mean that where those risks have been assessed and actually revised downwards, premiums can become lower. And because climate change is now widely accepted as a financial risk, this also means that failure to manage that risk properly exposes business to a higher level of liability under commercial laws. As was briefly touched on by Stephen, contract sharing for resources are put in place, but then what happens when those resources are needed earlier or they're not available? That has implications for contract liability. There's been an absolute explosion of climate change related litigation throughout the world. Not only run-of-the-mill type contractual disputes and things like that, but seeing claimants using existing laws in really creative ways. One example up there is the Illinois Farmers Insurance Company. They issued multiple class actions against the Chicago area municipalities in relation to business and residential policies payouts made in the wake of Superstorm Sandy. They alleged that the negligent failure of the municipalities to update their stormwater drains when they knew that there was going to be the increased likelihood of higher rainfall meant that actually they should be responsible for the losses incurred by Illinois farmers. It was a bit of a circular claim because Illinois Farmers is a subsidiary of Zurich Insurance, and Zurich Insurance insured the municipalities. So it wasn't really going to go anywhere, but it does show that companies, insurance companies, and people are starting to find creative ways to recover their losses in relation to climate change. Another climate-related issue emerging is the use of force majeure, the act of God contracts, and the reasonableness of these. In 2017, in South Australia, hundreds of thousands of Adelaide households and businesses lost power. Compensation was paid to those people when they suffered 12 hours of continuous blackouts. But because of the force majeure clauses in the contract, continuous excluded periods where repair crews could not operate due to bad weather. That meant that around 30,000 affected businesses and people missed out on compensation payments. It is expected that after this bushfire season, serious attention is going to be given to contractual risk allocation and the adequacy of force majeure clauses. In all of the doom and gloom of climate change, there are actually some opportunities, and especially for business. As has happened, many businesses, especially in agriculture, have had to use their own financial reserves or have taken in increased debt to respond to extreme weather events. More transformative adaptive changes, and even on a smaller scale, can be riskier and expensive for small businesses and individuals. However, it's clear that adaptation is the key for resilience and financial stability. There's been a big increase in the offering of debt instruments linked to sustainability, in addition to the explosive growth in the green bond market in recent years. Australian banks are really following suit from America, the US, and Asia in offering these instruments not only on an institutional level, but to small businesses who are needing to adapt and change. It's kind of low-hanging fruit, because if you are making the adaptations and doing the things anyway, why not leverage your position and go to the banks and say, these are all the great things I'm doing, link my loan to it. So as the climate continues to change and we continue to see the increase in frequency and ferocity of weather events, adapting to these to make your businesses financially resilient is really key. So there are a few things to consider and start thinking about, whereas it may seem an overwhelming challenge. There are small things to start considering. For example, contractual risk allocation, your supply chain management, and the cross-dependencies in your businesses. An example of where there has been a quite disastrous effect, not only for the people who were affected at the time, but for supply chain issues and the meeting of contractual obligations, has been in Malakuta, where essentially there is one way in, one way out, and where that's been affected, how does that affect your business, and how do those risks compare to your contracts and your supply chains? Responding to the effects of climate change requires significant adaptation of transport and infrastructure systems, as well as health and emergency response. And if rural and regional communities are adequately assessing those risks and vulnerabilities, the adaptation can allow for more resilient and financially stable communities and economies. So considering for you, your business, your home, your contractual risk allocation, supply chain management, and cross-dependencies, and then thinking about those things and the opportunities you can find from them to leverage your sustainability, to lower your cost of borrowing, to help make those adaptations.